From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Ahead today, K-State's Dan O'Brien will cover his latest marketing year projections for wheat prices. And he'll take another look at the current local basis relationship between corn and grain sorghum around Kansas during his weekly segment on the grain market trends. Then from Oklahoma State University, a guest to K-State this week, Brian Arnall talks about recent discoveries on the timing of nutrient applications to wheat and grain sorghum, applications conducted outside of what many of you producers would consider the normal time frame. Later, the final Kansas wheat harvest report of this season featuring Jeanne Falk Jones of the Sunflower Extension District in northwest Kansas, and K-State's Mary Knapp on Kansas agricultural weather. All that right here on Agriculture Today. Welcome aboard for another Agriculture Today here on the K-State Radio Network. Glad to have you along as the grain markets keep us entertained. Let's put it that way now as we talk with Dan O'Brien about the market trends once more, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. He is Mike side with us here in Manhattan this week. Start with this, Dan. The markets very swiftly moved on from the USDA's World Agricultural Supply and Demand Report on Monday. That information was quickly digested.
I think that's because the markets had taken into account what the acreage changes were going to be and pretty much accurately anticipated what that quarterly stocks report that came out on the June 30th had said also. So what the USDA had done is to bring those acreage numbers into these supply-demand balance sheets. Corn and soybeans, they didn't change in the yields per acre. So that is coming. That'll be down the road yet. But they did with wheat. And really, when you look at how markets have responded since that report came out on the 12th, we've had strength across the board. And on yesterday's markets, interesting that for corn and soybean futures, sideways a little bit lower, wheat still going up. Went up from September 21 through May, they were all up 10 3/4 to 12.5 cents. And again, it's just noteworthy that here during our harvest, we've seen the wheat market move strongly higher, and sure good to think about why that's happening. It's not necessarily because we have tremendous exports. We've got okay exports, but they're not at the pace to meet the USDA's projection yet. They're running slower. So for hard red winter wheat, we're harvesting a lot of product, but we have these ongoing continued reports out of the hard red spring wheat areas in the U.S. and Canada of tough conditions. And so we end up and have had ongoing underlying support for the wheat market even through the bulk of the Kansas wheat harvest. And that's kind of an extraordinary thing.
Well, let's go right into, if we might, the information that you've worked up, and we promised our listeners this was coming this week, the price probability projections for wheat for the marketing year. And you have plugged in all the new numbers, and, well, the results are pretty kind to producers.
Well, yeah, there's a projection for this 2021-22 marketing year, which began on June 1st to have a U.S. average price of about $6.60. Now, I also look at futures market prices and use basis estimates over the marketing year, with weighting what typical marketings are. And with that USDA's projection of $6.60, if you look at what were in the futures yesterday, it's more like $6.20 or $6.22. So that's just a note of caution, perhaps, in terms of where the markets might go. Let's say that there's a 50% chance that the USDA is absolutely right. We get that $6.60, and if anything, with the uptrends we've seen, you'd be overcautious to just discount that. But if you swing the USDA's export projection 100 million bushels either way, and that's very easily done, say there's 20% chance it swings higher. For that to happen, you'd have problems over in Russia, problems in Ukraine. Right now, there are problems in Russia, but not in Ukraine. And elsewhere, Australia, you'd be watching all those areas. You go from about $6.60 up 45 cents to about $7.05. And if we end up about 100 million bushels weaker than what the USDA has projected, and again, their exports at about 875 million bushels, if we drop that about 75 to 100 million bushels lower, you end up at about 625. So, it ends up being a swing of about 35, 45 cents either way. Just depends how the export side of it works out.
But if 625 for wheat is the worst case scenario, that speaks volumes, Dan.
What is thought-provoking to me is that the 625 that you end up with, based on kind of normal responsiveness of U.S. wheat prices to stocks to use, is just about what the futures are saying right now. So it's not entirely surprising that the futures would probably take a conservative track on how they expect things to go. And by a futures calculation, we're looking at September 21 through July of 22 and putting basis numbers on that, dividing up the months by percent that we normally market the crop over those time periods in those marketing years, and ending up with that. So if anything, the futures are probably representing about 100 million bushels less exports than what the USDA projected.
Might mention that the wheat price scenarios you just passed along are fully outlined in your weekly notes on the grain markets. Producers can have a direct look there. As far as the other grains, and more directly, the basis trends locally here in Kansas, and starting with grain sorghum. You say an interesting relationship developing vis-a-vis corn basis.
Well, sorghum is probably, at this point, given that the pace of exports haven't been as strong here of late as they were earlier in the year, at this time they're following the movements of corn futures with basis estimates. What's interesting for sorghum, as we look at that, is that the basis bids for sorghum on the cash markets are a little bit weaker than corn, but the new crop bids are as or stronger than corn. So what does that say? I think that's saying that although we don't have as much business right now in the spot cash market for sorghum, there's anticipation of forward purchases for sorghum that will give us just that much stronger prices. I guess when you look at, we'll pick a couple locations, say Colby on the one hand, Garden City on the other, and then Salina and Topeka. For Colby and Garden City, you're looking at cash corn prices $639 to $649, grain sorghum prices $604 to $614, so a little bit weaker. But the forward contract prices for corn at those locations $549, Colby $586, and Garden City with its strong feedlot industry and usage. The grain sorghum forward contract price out in Colby is for harvest delivery $587 versus $549 for corn, so $587 sorghum. Even in Garden City, where such a strong demand for corn, $616 as a basis for the forward contract bid, and as a price of forward contract bid, $586 for corn. And that's a pattern that holds up as or even more strongly in terms of that differential for Salina, Topeka, Hutchinson, and also for Columbus, although it's a little bit weaker down there. So even though we've had some weakness in export movement for grain sorghum, there must be anticipation that there'll be quite a bit of demand once we get more supplies out there and the market picks back up.
While we're talking basis, what about soybeans and how they're reading around Kansas? Is there strength to be had there?
There's in the 6 general locations that we follow, again, Colby, Salina, Topeka, Hutchinson, Columbus, out of those, the spot prices all start with a 14. And the only place a little bit below that, still tremendous, is that down southwest in the Garden City market, 1364. What's interesting about the forward bids with soybeans is that we're $12.90, $13.28, $13.30, $12.95, $13.25, $13.15 for forward contract bids. It's not that we don't have pricing opportunities that are at cost of production plus 10, 15, 20, 30, 40%. It's more right now dealing with the production risk of wanting to make sure you have something to fulfill those contracts with.
Volatility remains the watchword, though, and we have seen how the market is hyper-reactive to weather changes, particularly with respect to corn, with beans, and that's going to dominate for some time to come yet, Dan.
Yeah, I think that the really consistent pattern across the corn futures, the wheat futures, and the soybean futures is that the highs that we'd seen coming through April and May, we've gone up and touched them in the corn and wheat markets twice and come back down off of them. And if anything now, we're not seeing quite the extreme highs within the last several weeks. But again, in essence, we've run up, come back down. Corn, we've been pretty loath to go about 525 on the September futures contract. We've been pretty loath on the wheat contract to go also below 525. That's interesting to look at. And then on the soybean contract, pretty hesitant to move anything below $13. So I think I'd encourage people to look closely at those, well, to be aware of where the, quote, resistance is on the downside. And if we get to the point where futures prices grow confident that we'll have a crop, that there aren't great risks out there, and we start to move below those key areas, then we're in a situation where forward pricing heading off into harvest probably be more recommended.
Well, there's plenty of story yet to be told on those row crops and the conditions out there, but it's going to continue to become clearer as we move forward in time where that stands, and the markets will respond accordingly, of course. And Dan does gather notes on the markets and puts them out for you producers to have a look at weekly on the agmanager.info website. So we'd encourage you to check that out, including, again, his price probability projections for wheat this week. Dan, thank you, as always.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Good to have you by. Grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension, Dan O'Brien, with us each Friday. After this break, a look at quite interesting new research work out of K-State's counterpart institution in Oklahoma that was shared with participants in a special workshop here on the Kansas State campus this past week. Some new thinking on crop nutrient management. You'll hear about it next on Agriculture Today. Welcome back. You are listening to Agriculture Today. As was noted earlier on in the week, Kansas State University is hosting a special series of workshops here on the campus, and it focuses this series on precision agricultural technologies and management approaches. This is being put on for NRCS personnel here in the state. It's a really good session, great speakers across the board, including the individual we'll speak with. Now, he is out of Oklahoma State University, and we've had a chance to talk with him before. It's good to have a second chance to do so. Precision Nutrient Management Specialist at OSU, Brian Arnall. Brian, welcome to you once more, and we want to get into a bit of your current work in wheat and grain sorghum, but this sort of educational session has high value as you're participating in it.
Yeah, so it's an opportunity as the NRCS nationwide are building their precision ag programs and looking more into that technology. And so this is an opportunity for us at the land grants to help train those folks that are out in the counties and receiving the data and trying to interpret the data. So this is really us trying to help them to understand the data they're getting, whether it's from sensors or grid soil sampling, and then also help extend those recommendations and understand if a recommendation is proper or not based upon state 590 regulations and such.
It's a broad topic, isn't it?
We're going soil sampling, soil testing, yield monitor cleaning. Lucas is talking about yield monitors. And so precision ag is courses at most of our universities where students learn over multiple semesters, and we're hammering these folks over 2 days.
What we would like to do here is get caught up on a couple of your areas of nutrient management research out of OSU, of high interest, of course, here in Kansas, given the two crops we'll talk about. You are looking at wheat nitrogen management and tying genetics to that management?
Yeah, really. So over the last 5 or 6 years, I've been interested in nitrogen timing in wheat and really shifting from a pre-plant anhydrous environment, which was dominant in Oklahoma, and looking at more in-season because our environment is not stable by any means. It's never been stable in the Southern Plains, but we are dry and wet and hot and cold and everything in between. And so I really promote in-season activities so that we can take advantage of what's happened or not happened. And so the questions come is how late can we wait on nitrogen? And I've done all my work running OGI varieties, the Bentley's double stops, many of the things, maybe primarily our grades and grains, and have had phenomenal success with really delaying nitrogen until hollow stem. And beyond success, it is better yields and better proteins. And I'm not talking a 50-50 split. I'm talking all nitrogen in the spring. Starter and pop-up is fine. And we're really hitting it out of the park. But with some work with some local consultants in Oklahoma that have stretched up into Kansas around the Caldwell area, I've had an opportunity to look at nitrogen timing across multiple genetics. So I'm seeing the SY wheats, the KWA wheats, Bob Doles, and everything from Monument down. And in that project, I'm seeing that the response to nitrogen timing is different. And so now we're investigating this genetic by-nutrient management, finding that there are cultivars that really like nitrogen early, fall and early spring, and others that respond better to a later nitrogen. And so we're really kind of in the mix and really getting in deep to parsing it out because we don't have the answers yet.
When you talk of these quite late nitrogen applications, similar rates overall going on that wheat that would be otherwise conventional at a, quote, normal time?
So what we're finding is with the delayed nitrogen, we're able to apply a lot less too. So I had one study that had low rates, so 90 pounds of nitrogen per acre applied pre-plant or different points in season, and that's below optimum. I use low rates to see efficiencies because if I apply too much, then I don't see a small change in efficiency. So that 90 pounds, and I'm growing 60 and 70 bushel wheat off of 90 pounds. But we also have at the same trial 180 pounds to see, okay, well, 180 should get me, in most cases, all I need. And even at that 180, the pre-plant in some of our environments is yielding less than in season. The 90, absolutely. When you're under applying fertilizer, if you're shooting a little bit below the plant need, the pre-plant is almost always worse. And so as we move in season, the 90 out-yielded the pre-plant, and the 180 out-yielded the similar pre-plant. And even the splits, because we had a 45-45 split pre and sometime in season, the 90 in season was outdoing the split application.
You gather this information. Is the hope here to take this back up the chain to the genetics? What's making these differences happen?
Yeah, so, this is an odd thing. So I'm a soils guy that gets confused by crop physiology and morphology, and so I'm doing my best to understand. And so I'm working with, like, Dr. Silva, who's now our small grains, who came out of Kansas, and so our ties there, and I'm learning a lot from her on the physiology, and our breeder, Brett Carver. And so a couple things we're seeing working with them is that we have high-protein wheats and low-protein wheats. We've been looking at those in different environments to find out why are they high and low. And the most recent data coming out is suggesting that our high-protein wheats are high because they continue the uptake of nitrogen well beyond flag leaf and anthesis, and they're still uptaking. Our low-protein wheats in the OGI system are low, and they effectively stop uptake around that flowering point, and so all the nitrogen going to the grain is being translocated from the plant matter. And so we're seeing this. We've also got other work that we're going to start chasing that works more on the genetic side, is that many crops, cotton, sorghum, brassicas, have been shown that when nitrogen deficient, produce more root and less shoot. And so we're going to start this fall screening the genetics to see, can we actually manage a crop to make more roots by delaying that nitrogen, having some nitrogen deficiencies? Because I don't know if I would say most Kansas would agree, but in Oklahoma, I want a better root system. So when we stop raining, because it's always going to stop raining someday, we've got roots to chase it.
Interesting angles there. And speaking of grain sorghum, you're taking a somewhat similar tact on the nitrogen application timing there in your research?
Yeah, so just because sorghum isn't planted on our best acres and it's not always getting the best stands, I like in season on sorghum. I want to make sure I have a stand before I make an application. And even our old specialist, Rick Kokenhauer, was always against me on, he wanted to pre-plant to make sure we maxed out. So kind of looking into that, we want to see how late could we wait, and found out that we could apply, as long as it rained, we could apply up to boot all of our nitrogen and do quite well. But the kicker is, okay, I'm in sorghum and I want to wait until boot stage or before that to apply my nitrogen. what methods do I have? Do I have an applicator to do drops? Can I build a drop? So we have producers who are building drops, nozzles on their own, and kind of some homemade operations. Twitter was all over me a couple weeks ago and showing me all the different drops they were doing. PVC pipe is really fascinating. But we want to say, okay, I'm not going to build that. I'm just going to use my sprayer. What impacts do I have of different nozzle selections? So we looked at streamer bars and SJ3, so the T-Jet 3 streams versus flat fans. And we don't have the data yet, but we've done everything from 20 gallons per acre flat fanned on at 100 degrees on boot size sorghum down to drops and everything in between 60-inch spacings, 30s. And what we're seeing is, and other research, at least visually, is that between the row streamers, we can take a fair amount of foliage damage and not lose anything. We still got to get to yield, and we still have to need how that efficiency of that nitrogen works. But it all looks positive that we can take damage, we can lose a little bit of that tissue, and still be efficient on our nitrogen.
What, in a percentage term, does that efficiency look like then when you go this route?
Yeah, so we don't know as far as the method goes. If I just look at timing, and so the timing work is more of a dribble band of dry urea, ammonium nitrate, safe, and something there. If we just look at the plant efficiencies, we're improving our efficiencies by 30 or 40% by going in season. Again, that disregards necessarily a method. We're using, that's more about the plant efficiencies. So we're looking at that. One interesting aspect that we're working with Kansas State on in recent, and we just sent some samples in wheat, and we'll do in sorghum, to look at the relationship of AMF fungi. So this AMF fungi is a symbiotic organism that will work with plants, and it will extend their root system so that it gets more water, more nutrients. Well, AMF fungi do not like to grow in a high nutrient system. And so the curiosity is, by delaying this, by having our crop is going through deficiencies, meaning it's signaling the system that it needs more nitrogen, are we increasing this symbiotic relationship early, and does it sustain after we apply nitrogen later? So we're really chasing physiology. We're chasing symbiotic relationships with fungi. We're just chasing agronomics of how do we get it on in the season.
Here we thought we already knew everything there is to know about how nutrients interact with crop plants as they grow wheat and sorghum in this case. And obviously there's a bit more to be discovered out there.
Absolutely. And it's been really fun. And it's some of the things I'm learning have gone against my teachings on how we manage nitrogen. It's really fascinating what doors have been opened.
Keep up the great work. It's always good to hear about it. Thanks for sharing a couple of moments with us and for being a participant in this workshop here at K-State. Always appreciate your time.
It's a pleasure being in Manhattan.
Brian Arnall with us from Oklahoma State University, Precision Nutrient Management Specialist at OSU, one of the presenters at that special precision agriculture workshop put on for NRCS professionals here at K-State earlier this week. Agriculture Today returns after these moments away on the K-State Radio Network. Agriculture Today continues on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson here, and with our final Kansas wheat harvest update of our series featuring extension agricultural agents around Kansas. And we'll finish off with the word from far northwest Kansas and the Sunflower Extension District. Jeanne Falk Jones is the multi-county agronomist serving that district. So it's been a drawn-out harvest, we understand, much as it has in other parts of the state up in your territory, Jeanne?
Yes, it has been. It feels like we got a little bit of a late start this year just because of the wheat conditions and what Mother Nature gave to us for weather. And so, many cases we are really in the thick of it or done by the 4th of July, and felt like this year we were just kind of getting started on it. And so here we are, on the 16th, and we are still whittling away at wheat harvest here in northwest Kansas.
Yeah. How much is left, though? How close are your producers to being done?
In many cases, we have guys that have just finished up in the last 2 or 3 days, and then we have another group of guys who are looking at hopefully this weekend, kind of getting to the end of harvest. But I think a lot of guys are close to being done or are done.
Yeah. Well, a quick review, if we might, of the general conditions for the wheat crop in that 3-county area. You describe it, Jeanne, as a roller coaster.
Yeah, it really has been a roller coaster this year. When we were drilling last fall, it seems like the earlier drilled wheat actually came up pretty well. We got it into moisture, pretty good stand establishment. As we worked a little later into October, we kind of lost some of our soil moisture, and so getting stands established was a bit of a concern, and in many cases, it felt like we didn't have great stands going into the winter, and thankfully we had some moisture over the winter and into early spring that really kind of helped get the wheat up, get it established, and then we had some very timely rains this spring that really helped get those spring tillers established, which those spring tillers were very important to us this year in many cases on our yields at harvest time here.
So as you rolled through the spring, the yield prospects were looking fairly rosy, although the weather the earlier part of the summer, then early and mid-June, you say took the top off of those yields.
Yes, that's exactly right. Once we had those moisture events to really help get those spring tillers established, then we kind of kept catching little rains along that was helping hold our wheat, keeping our wheat going. And there was a few times I think everybody got a little nervous. Our wheat had kind of a drought stress, kind of a blue look to it. And then we would catch a very, very timely rain to kind of help move that wheat along. And then that second week of June, we had 100-plus degree temperatures for 5 or 6 days, and we felt like had a really good yield potential. That heat, and it was pretty dry during that period, kind of took the top end yield potential off. And so while we had some farmers who were looking around thinking that we would have 80, 90, 100 bushel dryland wheat, that hot temperatures really did, and the dry conditions really did take kind of the top end off of our yield potential there.
What numbers at the end were you hearing about and seeing in the way of test weights and, of course, yields?
Okay, so as I make some general statements like that where we had good timely rains, some folks kind of got left out in those or weren't as lucky in catching some of those timely rains. And as a result, at harvest time here, we're seeing a pretty big spread of yield. And so in many cases, that 40 to 80 bushel per acre really catches all of it. And that sounds like a really wide range, except once you get into specific areas that caught rain, we would see 70 and 80 bushel yields very regularly, but then you would go 5 miles down the road to someone who didn't catch the very timely rains, and some of those fields were doing 50 bushel per acre. And so definitely a big spread across the area, it felt like, for yield. And then, there are the outliers. We had some dryland wheat that was going over 90 bushel per acre in some cases, and then, unfortunately, we had some that was lower than 40 in some cases also. On test weight, I would say 56 to 60 pounds really caught all of that. So 56 to 60 pounds for test weight. And a lot of that is related to some of those hot temperatures. And then in some cases, we were waiting on some rain showers moving through at harvest time. And so we also lost a little bit of test weight in those conditions.
Well, then the results weren't uniform by any stretch. However, when you look at it all in all, not a bad year for wheat in that district?
Not at all. That's exactly right. I think everybody was thankful for what we had, considering some of our drilling conditions last fall, because our expectations for this wheat crop really have been just all over the board this year. And sometimes I feel like I see that all the time, but it really did. We took some pretty big swings, and we had some disease issues that we were seeing out here, including some dryland crown rot. We had some head scab showed up. We were very much on the alert for stripe rust and did some treatment for that. And so, some of those things that we can treat for, it's hard to make a decision on some of that when our yield potential is just all over the board. So I think in general, everybody's just very excited to have as good a yield as we are out here this year.
Jeanne, as always, we appreciate it. Many thanks to you.
Thanks, Eric.
Jeanne Falk Jones there, the multi-county agronomist for the Sunflower Extension District. Again, that's Cheyenne, Sherman, and Wallace counties in northwest Kansas. That concludes our Wheat Harvest Report series, and we'd like to earnestly thank all of those county and district extension agricultural agents around Kansas for helping us out here with their input on harvest progress and results in their locations around the state. Greatly appreciated. And taking us up to the break, this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop with Marcia Boswell. Marcia?
As Kansas wheat farmers are delivering their last loads of grain to the elevator for the 2021 wheat harvest, they are evaluating the yield and quality of the varieties they planted. Behind this decision, however, is an entire wheat breeding pipeline. And beyond agronomic characteristics, another factor also influences which varieties make it from the greenhouse to combine: consumer preferences. The Wheat Foods Council discussed how consumers influence wheat variety selection in a video featuring wheat expert Dr. Brett Carver. Carver is the Wheat Genetics Chair in Agriculture at Oklahoma State University. The video is part of a series answering common questions by consumers, including how wheat has changed over the last 100 years, the difference between wheat breeding and GMOs, and more. In the video, Carver explained, for so long, wheat producers pretty much governed what the consumer would receive in the grocery store. But now that script has kind of flipped. The consumer, you and I, are influencing what the wheat farmer is growing. In Kansas, this pipeline traces all the way back to the wheat breeding program at Kansas State University. Learn more about the K-State breeding program at kswheat.com. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia, and we'll be back with more on Agriculture Today. To cap off this Friday edition of Agriculture Today, it's to the Kansas agricultural weather scene and the very latest from the Weather Data Library here at K-State and Research and Extension climatologist Mary Knapp. Good to more than ample rainfall around and about Kansas this week, Mary. But it's to note that this comes on the heels of the latest drought monitor, which showed that dry conditions actually intensified here and there in the state prior to this week's rains.
Right. Our U.S. drought monitor ends on Tuesday. And in that period, only 2 divisions were above normal, the Northeast and the Southwest. So on opposite sides of the state, they ranged above normal. Not everybody in those divisions saw those rainfall totals, but a good portion of it did. And that, of course, was very welcome in the Southwest. They'd been missing out on the storms a little bit, and in the Northeast, they really wanted to keep things going. But the North Central, Central, South Central didn't fare very well. In fact, the South Central and the Central saw less than 10% of their normal weekly precipitation, which is why it's no surprise that the U.S. Drought Monitor had a big expansion of the abnormally dry conditions.
Once more, though, to remind, that was up till Tuesday, and the better part of the rain this week occurred then and afterward.
Right. Most of it came Wednesday and into Thursday, and there are still lingering areas that are seeing a little bit today. The north central and western part of northeast Kansas was kind of the hot spot for it. We're talking in northern Riley County into Clay County, where there were a number of places that had over 6 inches of rainfall. Not surprisingly, that did produce some flooding. The rains also continued as you went further east, although not in those super heavy amounts. Unfortunately, with that flooding, there were numerous traffic accidents, including a fatal one in Pot County. And it serves as a reminder again that when it's in that heavy rain mode, you really need to be careful and watch out. Hydroplaning is a big issue and was a factor in most of the accidents that were reported.
Yeah. What areas are likely remaining hurting for moisture?
Well, the central and south central, while they saw some rain, didn't see huge amounts, so they are likely to take a little bit longer to get out of that abnormally dry. Another pocket of abnormally dry conditions has developed in northwest Kansas, and so we really would like to see a little bit of these storms make their way into that corner of the state. The southeast is probably ready for another rain event as well. They tend to be, with their claypan soils, 2 weeks away from a drought or a flood. So that's another area that would not object to getting a moderate amount of rainfall, not the heavy rains that plagued our area.
Now, with all of this, the last week or so, temperatures have remained moderate for the most part, just what the corn crop was calling for as it goes through tasseling.
Right. We saw temperatures in the 80s. There were a few 90s in the western part of the state. For most of the state, it was cooler than would be typical at this time of the year, so cooler than normal. We had a low as cool as 48 degrees, and that was down in Ulysses in Grant County. So, again, some cool temperatures to provide a little bit of relief from the muggy heat that has plagued the state.
So what did that do in as far as the growing degree units for, well, particularly sorghum?
Right. Corn, as you noted, was perfectly happy with the temperature range that we were going, but sorghum is a warm season crop. It likes a little bit warmer temperatures, so development has not been as rapid on the sorghum. And that has been an issue in the past couple of summers where we have a lot of heat in June and then temperatures moderate in July and August. They have released the August outlook, and that favors neutral conditions, equally likely to be warmer or cooler than normal. If we extend that out a little bit farther for the late summer, early fall, which is August through October, it favors warmer than normal conditions. So we still have plenty of time to get that growing degree units on the sorghum up and accumulating so that we can have a timely fall harvest.
And as a matter of fact, looking more immediately to next week's forecast, you say that daytime heat, anyway, will return.
Right. As we go into next week, we do have chances of rain over the weekend, which will keep the temperatures down. But as we move into Tuesday, Wednesday, and the extended forecast, it is looking like it will be highs in the 90s, which would be a little bit warmer than is typical at this time of the year, but certainly not oppressive. So a little bit of warmth to get that sorghum a boost in its growing degree accumulation.
And you look at that extended forecast, 6 to 10, 8 to 14. Chances of moisture here and there to round out the month of July?
Well, they are both the 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 are slightly favoring drier than normal conditions. Keep in mind that does not mean we're not going to get rain at all, but if your normal rainfall for a week is 3/4 of an inch and you get a half an inch, you're going to be behind. Still, if we get it in timely intervals and in timely amounts, the crop will fare perfectly well. What we don't really need is a repeat of the excess of rains or to not get anything at all.
And any new word on La Nina?
The La Nina watch has been issued. It is still expected to move into that cooler than normal waters off the Pacific this fall. Right now, the best chance for onset is in the late fall, in the October-November timeframe. For us, the later the onset is, the less influence it tends to have on Kansas weather. There are other factors that dominate, so we'll have to see how that develops. But at this point, it does look like it's going to be a late onset. For us, the strongest influence, again, is in the fall, the September-October timeframe. During the winter, it usually favors milder than normal temperatures and sometimes a wetter pattern, but mostly it's a more open winter than might be otherwise.
Mary, thank you for being along with us.
Thanks, Eric.
Mary Knapp, climatologist, K-State Research and Extension, and we thank you as well for joining us and welcome you right back here on Monday. Until then, Eric Atkinson here, bidding you a good weekend for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.